get to ask questions. My name's Amber. I'm a trainee teacher at the moment and a member of Counterforum. We've got Michael, Andrew and Faisy, and they're going to be talking about the assault on the universities and mainly framing it around the book that I believe has just come out. So I'm going to hand straight over to you guys.
Thank you, Amber. I just want to spend 5-10 minutes saying something about the publication. So it's a book that was edited by myself and a colleague, Des Friedman, who teaches at Goldsmiths. The occasion for the book, is obviously the proposed new fee regime and the recent sort of protests that we've seen this past 12 months or so, particularly the demonstrations last November. But also Des and I felt that at the time there was a lot of media misrepresentation, and in fact Des himself was a victim, him and one or two other colleagues at Goldsmiths, because they simply wrote a letter in response to Millbank, the occupation of Millbank, saying that the real violence wasn't the students occupying Millbank, but the violence is being done by the current government, but also the system of capitalism more generally. It's also part book, part manifesto. And in the back, there's a series of demands on government, but also employers, which is to say universities, not least the scrapping of tuition fees, but also the restoration of the subject grant. And there's a long list of various demands that's being signed by very nearly 1,000 academics now, including the contributors, of which Phase is one. In terms of what I just want to say, I thought that I'd speak really what it is to be an academic. So I'm speaking here very much in a personal capacity about what I think to be the effects of the marketisation of higher education, not just in this past 12 months, but it's been going on now for 10, 15, 20 years. But specifically in terms of this new fee regime, I think it's fair to say that many of my colleagues are deeply concerned that it will disproportionately affect those students from socially disadvantaged families, or even families with modest means, who won't be able to afford to come to university. And indeed, what we've seen this past 2 months is UCAS saying that there has been a significant decrease in applications compared to this time last year. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we find that that decrease is very much students from non-traditional families, university education. It's also concerning because universities themselves have yet to make this clear. They're claiming that they can offset this shortfall in public funding through a whole series of widening participation activities, students' scholarships, and Andrew may say a little bit about this later. That's not clear how that's going to work. Many universities are actually saying that this £9,000 fee actually doesn't cover the shortfall in government funding. So quite how they're going to fund studentships isn't yet clear. So I'm not persuaded that universities will commit, as they have done this past 10 years, to widening participation. Also, it's unclear what statutory powers the Office for Fair Access will have at its disposal to discipline those institutions that don't meet their diversity targets. And I think there's a real problem in this country where so-called regulatory bodies are too light touch, indeed completely toothless. And again, that's something I think we need to flesh out in the coming months. The second issue, and I'm speaking now really in terms of my experience of working in academia as a fairly, newly qualified academic, early career academic, are the consequences of things like the RAEs, the Research Assessment Exercise, or what's now known as the Research Excellence Framework, and this resulting change between research and teaching. And for the past 10, 15 years, academics have been under increasing pressures to publish or perish. It's this idea that if you're not churning out publications, then you're not doing your job. And what this has resulted in, I think, is increasingly academics, particularly newly qualified academics, prioritising research over and above teaching. That they're no longer committed to teaching in the way that, say, academics were 20, 30 years ago. And I think that's really problematic. And that's because they have to cut corners to meet the next publishing deadline. So this expectation that you can somehow combine, often heavy teaching loads with research and endless admin duties, again, is deeply problematic. And this says nothing of the way in which the instrumentalisation of research, I think, has atomised any kind of collective sense of an academic community. Typically academics in recent years have become very atomised, and it's because of the sort of, the way in which we're audited in terms of research outputs. We're made to compete effectively with one another. And it's also, concerning because the rationale for this new audit culture has nothing to do with academia. It's got nothing to do with education. The sort of rationality, in fact, these increasing layers of micromanagement and performance indicators can actually be traced back to the US Ivy Business League business schools, and also consultancy firms such as Baines and McKinsey. The other issue that I think is sort of become increasingly difficult for academics is this unyielding pressure to secure what's called external funding, otherwise known as grant capture. And it's problematic because what you see as a result of this are increasing numbers of academics sort of posturing more as consultants than they are educationalists, in the belief that research that has a sort of technocratic function is the surest way to sort of gain promotion. And should the forthcoming REF go ahead with the so-called impact agenda, which it will, which will roughly account for something like 25% of how departments are ranked, and that then determines the money that they're allocated by HEFCE. The situation will become almost certainly worse. And in fact, a recent article by Stefan Kalina, he sort of notes that the consequences could be disastrous, not least because academics will be judged and rewarded a bit like salesmen who will be forced into sort of hustling and hawking their intellectual wares. And I think this brings us to the crux of the matter, that as universities sort of scrabble around trying to sort of fill this sort of gap in public funding, more than likely you'll see universities sort of forming partnerships with, sort of potentially manipulative or corrupt power elites. I think the recent controversy surrounding the LSE in Libya is just a case in point, where a number of very senior academics who really ought to have known better, I'm not going to name them, but one of them just recently announced that he's leaving for Durham, chairing politics, have been quite shameless in sort of taking money from, autocratic regimes, effectively blood money, and all kinds of dubious goings on surrounding ghostwriting PhDs and so forth. So just to conclude, I think it's really important that as a profession, academics do everything they can to resist the democratization of education, but it's not enough to do that in and through moral indignation or democratic criticism. I think what academics need to be doing more of, events such as today, is trying to form broader alliances, partnerships, not just with students, but public sector, university workers, those kinds of sort of connections, which I don't think it's been the case so far. I think academics actually have been a little bit complicit, a bit sort of compliant in this sort of marketisation of education. And I think only then, if we get this broader alliance, which hopefully we'll see on the 30th of November, might politicians rethink this assault, not just on education, but the welfare state at large. Okay, we'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I go next?
Just pass straight over.
Okay, well, in light of what Michael's spoken about, I'll concentrate on a slightly different angle. The white paper for higher education and its associated documents and things like the comprehensive spending review from last November are part of an extended plan for higher education, and often that plan is botched in detail, but partly as a result of the compromises that have been made with the junior coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats. But in terms of, in certain sense, that presents a problem for organising against it, because it's so wide-ranging and dispersed and piecemeal that different aspects of it are coming through at different times and through different measures. So, for example, the white paper itself announced 15 different consultations or reviews, all with different timetables. Different pieces of legislation using statutory instruments were put before Parliament in August and became law in September. Those of you with some understanding of parliamentary process know that meant this happened in the summer recess when no MPs were around to examine those pieces of legislation. So one of the challenges of organisation is just keeping on top of what's going on. The example I always use is that things that are kind of trumpeted in the press as the new reality around the student loan scheme, say for example the interest rates and the repayment thresholds, are still not in law, they haven't had parliamentary approval because the mechanisms are such that certain things have to happen before other things can, and yet we have things like the Independent Student Finance Task Force telling people this is the new reality, and in fact there's a whole set of democratic checks that haven't happened yet. So part of the problem with the opposition is addressing this problem of the democratic deficit, that these plans are so complex and wide-ranging and they're not properly presented to the public that it's not really clear quite how dramatic the consequences are going to be. And yet you can still see opposition dispersed across, you know, several parts of this country. So for example, the Daily Mail has given over large parts of its personal finance pages to address the fact that the loans will have a huge impact on middle class finances. If you read the official Oxford and Cambridge reports on the white paper, then they see the challenges to recruitment, which Michael's mentioned in terms of potentially giving more powers to offer, as a huge challenge to their own institutional autonomy. If you look at some of the university lobby groups, they're opposed to the artificial supply side mechanism in recruitment that's being imposed on the universities in order to create this new market. It's so restrictive that it's going to actually squeeze some established universities that, you know, should have no difficulty recruiting, because we know from the UCAS figures 200,000 applicants a year fail to get into university, and there's assessments which say 40 to 100,000 of them are qualified to go to university. And at this point in time, the coalition government is putting a total cap on student numbers and forcing universities to recruit differently, precisely because there's this rigged market in place. There should be no problem with any university recruiting students, and yet some universities may become unviable in the new regime. And part of this is designed to push an established middle sector of universities into becoming cheap degree shops and driving their fees down below 7,500, because the big problem the government has is the expense. The loan scheme is an enormous potential liability to the country in future years. If you look at some VCs are opposed to it because they don't want to be forced to move the money that they provide in access agreements to fee waivers rather than bursaries, which support students while they're studying. In their eyes, fee waivers simply save the Treasury money, and yet in order to meet this condition of 7,500, they will have to shift money from bursaries into fee waivers. People like the Campaign for Public University have rightly identified that the whole idea of higher education in the white paper is about training for employability, and that really the only point of going to university is it's a human capital investment where the return on that investment is higher earnings, and no other vision of education is in the white paper, and this will have enormous knock-on consequences for social equality. Now, even the architects of the loan scheme, the guys who came up with this idea of income contingent repayment loans, they're in despair over it. They think their vision, their loan scheme, which should have done something quite different, has now, because of various political compromises, and I quote, it now has all the hallmarks of a dodgy PFI scheme, because the way in which the government accounts for loans is quite astonishing, and I can't really go into it here, but I'm happy to respond to it in questions. But on the official figures released by the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills over the summer, they project that by 2046, outstanding student loan debt will be 191 billion. Now that's a fifth of the current national debt, and that's in today's prices. So if the government gets its estimates wrong about how much students, graduates pay back, this country could be left with an enormous additional level of debt that it can't service, or have to service in some other way on future taxpayers. So there's a potential here of like a bombshell waiting for 30 years' time. The loan scheme is so badly designed that repayments annually only match and exceed the annual outlay for new loans made in 2040. So it takes 25 years for the scheme to reach maturity, and it's only at that point that the money coming in from graduate repayments actually matches the money loaned out every year to new students. It's a really dangerous looking scheme. And so most of that debate is concentrated on what's it like to be a student faced with this debt, but actually from the mechanics and the accounting of it, it looks like not enough money is going to come back in over the next few years, and in fact we may be left as taxpayers and generally with a huge problem. And then you'd have a double whammy, because or a triple whammy in a certain sense, because the graduates would have had to pay the repayments back, but then there are also taxpayers who are going to have to meet this potential liability, and more than likely they would have had a reduced quality degree in return. 1 minute. Okay. Just to wrap up then, that's the kind of broad problem of the opposition. The challenge for organising against it is how do you bring all these different elements who are opposed to it into some kind of unified campaign that could stop the worst aspects. I'll just conclude by saying the thing that I think is most important to concentrate on is the way in which for-profit providers will be allowed to come into the system on equal terms, and in particularly large multinational education conglomerates with whom Willits met 12 times prior to the publication of the white paper. For them, having access to the student loan book is risk-free money, because they get the money for fees, but the relationship of the debt is then between the student and the government. The student loans company acts as a factor then on behalf of profit-making companies collecting the debts, and the company walks away. And remember, with the loan scheme, it's a taxpayer-supported loan scheme. So effectively, if those students go and do degrees with for-profit providers or places owned by for-profit providers, if they fail to repay the money they've loaned, that's basically a taxpayer subsidy to a large American multinational. And we shouldn't, just to conclude, we really need to be aware of the scale of these companies. Pearson's is already in the system and is likely to be given degree awarding powers. When the Libyan issue at LSE came up, Pearson also had a problem because the Libyan Sovereign Investment Fund owned 3%, I think, of Pearson's shares. On the basic figures, that meant that the Libyan Sovereign Investment Fund had $400 million investment in Pearson. Now you can do the maths there quickly. If that's 4% of the company is $400 million, that means there's a market capitalization of roughly $10 billion. This one company is about a fifth the size of the entire English university network. If they come into the system, they could really present problems. And just to finally finish with a quote from the official Cambridge University response to the white paper, they say that these companies could basically undercut the market for a long time. So they may be prepared to operate initially at a loss to take market share from some universities that will then become unviable. So in this new recruitment terrain where there's a limit on the number of students in place, if new providers come in, and they're essentially these large-scale for-profit companies who can undercut the established provision and take students away from what we currently understand to be our university sector, we could see the collapse of a large part of what we would understand to be our higher education sector, and to finish without any democratic oversight of this.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. There really are some startling figures and facts there, aren't there? Our last speaker is Faisy, who's a sort of contributor to the book of Saltman Universities, which I just say is on sale at the Houseman's Bookshop outside. If you would like to get it, it is recommended with all of these information that are expanded on as well. Faisy.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things about last year, the student movement last year, and then focus on what I think we need to do this year. I think everyone who was involved in the student movement last year would agree that, and in fact those watching the student movement unfold, would agree that the occupations were a central pillar of the movement, that one of the things that made the headlines and made it so successful was the occupations. I mean, it was the demonstration that on the 10th of November that the NUS called that kicked it all off. It was the mass demonstration. But having an occupation, you know, in the middle of campus, you know, in the case of SOAS just across the way, brought the issue of fees and cuts directly to student, staff, and management in a very localized way. There was no way that anyone could ignore the trebling of fees with the occupation on campus. And I think that it was these two elements, the occupations combined with, or the massive demonstrations combined with the occupation of physical space, that were mutually reinforcing, and I think which sustained the student movement. I mean, every occupation had its distinct features. I mean, there were so many going on around here. You know, some were more militant, some were more media savvy, some were more active. But I think every single one of them was crucial because they weren't sort of apolitical or neutral spaces. They were very political. They were bold, they were decisive, they were clearly in opposition to government, in that sense very political. And because of that, they forced students and staff to get off the fence and you know, either support it or not, basically to take sides. And it also forced debates around the meaning and the value of higher education, and this is what we were talking about in a lot of the occupations. at SOAS, it took a few days for the staff to get off the fence and support the occupations. Obviously, it meant opposing management in a very direct way, and I had personally quite a bitter experience of that because it changed. But it took something like 4 days. But when they did finally get off the fence, it transformed the occupation. It gave it a certain legitimacy. It encouraged more people to engage with it, and it put a new kind of pressure on the management. And all of a sudden, the occupation became kind of a badge of honor. It became, the principled thing to do. So the fact that there were so many occupations, I think the last count was about 46 across the country, and the fact that they were happening at the same time, put pressure, I think, on university management in a localized way, but it also dealt a blow to the government, on a national level, because they were part of this national student, this nationwide student movement. And I think all of this, the militant action at the local level, the mass action at the national level, really made the kind of breadth and the depth and the unity of the student movement that ultimately shaped public opinion in favor of the students and against the government. We didn't beat the government on that day, but I think the legacy of the movement was that it created a serious crisis around the issue of the fees on the day of the vote. And I think it will be remembered for really opening the fight and bringing it to the streets, opening the fight against austerity. And I think it made a lot of people across all sections of society question the government's priorities in a way that they hadn't done before. It was sort of seen as almost inevitable before, and I think the students really opened that up and really challenged it. So now it's been almost exactly a year since the student movement started. And since then, we've seen the Arab Spring, we've had the Murdoch scandal, we've had a war in Libya, we've had the riots over the summer, imminent meltdown of the Eurozone. And those are just, some of the government's problems. So I think, that anger, far from having dissipated, I think it's very much still there. So while they face a crisis, or a series of crises, I think that we need to escalate our action on all fronts. The main focus for us, and it's been said in other sessions, has to be the 30th of November. Last year, the student movement, we had a certain autonomy because we were ahead of the unions. Last year when people said, students and workers unite and fight, in a way that didn't mean very much at the time, because we students were in the lead. There was a situation where people were looking to the students. The whole of society, in a way, was looking to the students. That's changed now. The unions have started to move, and now that sentiment, I think, does make sense. I think we need to have unity across all sectors of society. It's true, and I think it's right in that context that we focus on the 30th of November. And students, I think, still play a central role. Precisely because we know that combination that we learned so well last year, that combination of mass demonstrations and local occupations actually works very well. We did manage to get, to put the government on the back foot. And it can help politicize and generalize N30, in a way that, it might sound obvious, but in a way that it's not just seen as a day about pensions. It's a day against it's a day of general anger against austerity and the government in general. Obviously, I hope the 9th of November is as big as possible. But I do think we need to be more strategic. I think we need to put pressure on the NUS to do more, to back the 9th of November properly, and to back the 30th in a more meaningful way. I went onto the NUS website the other day. Nothing about November 30th. Their headline at the moment is Movember, grow a mustache for November to help prostate cancer. I'm not against people who have prostate cancer, but they have put their logo on the leaflet for the 9th of November. They are doing nothing, as far as I can see, to actually build it. So we need to put pressure on the NUS, but that's not all. We also need to put pressure on our individual student unions, on our own student unions, to back the occupations, in the run-up to the 30th. occupations are not easy to pull off. They can sometimes take time, but it's not rocket science either. We did it. A lot of people did it. And I think that's what we need to be arguing now with our student unions and with the widest layers of students at every university, as much as possible. That we need to do this. We need to occupy in the run up to the 30th of November. And to do that and to get the demonstrations, I think we need to do a number of things. I mean, a lot of us know this already in terms of the bread and butter of what we do in terms of organizing. We have to be leafleting every day. We have to get posters up every day. We have to make announcements in class. We have to have trade unionists come to universities and have meetings with students. We have to show film nights and have meetings about strikes. We have to get the message out there in everyone's head, the significance and the potential of N30. And I think we need to have an emergency union meeting in every university about occupations. And there's got to be some level of coordination about it, because I think, one of the outstanding strengths of the movement last year was that it was happening in most universities. I mean, that is the strength of the Occupy movement now, the fact that it started in over 950 cities and that it's still happening across the world. That is the strength of it. So I think occupying the universities is one of the greatest acts of solidarity that we can show to those striking on the 30th of November. I mean, I just want to end with this, that we did an amazing thing last year. It was militant, it was broad, it was unified for the most part of it, and we really annoyed the government, which was brilliant. I don't think we should lose our nerve now. I think that we as students, we can be one dynamic and radicalized part of a wider movement against austerity. And I think the key thing to rebuilding the student movement, rebuilding our confidence, is and getting hundreds of thousands of people back out onto the streets is how we build for the 30th of November. And I think that's what we should focus on, and we can start with the 9th of November.
Thank you, Faisy. Just because we are a little short on time, what I'm going to do is just take 3 questions, if that's okay, and that gives Andrew, Michael, and Faisy a fair amount of time to be able to then answer them, because we are quite short. So if people want to put their hands up, and I'll just pick 3 people. So anyone else ask a question? We'll start with.
Okay, it's mainly in response to what you just said about the occupation and mass protests. I took part in both occupations and mass protests, like several of them. I felt they were completely ignored, in fact. I mean, the government kind of took notice, the media took notice in that they reported on it, but it was very, very negative and very impotent response. There was no real suggestion that they were going to change their minds. It was simply, and a lot of things like the occupations were criticised as illegitimate and illegal occupations of property. So that's one thing, is like, how are we, I don't feel they were very successful at all. And I think we need to work on much more innovative ways of protest, actually, rather than continuing the same quite passive forms of protest. And the second, that's all right, the second point is that actually I think we need to move it out of universities, because what seems to be happening is the public seems to be divided against each other, in that everyone's fighting their own corner in terms of what they want to win back. So by staging protests against university fees, the raises in fees, it makes it a very localized problem, and literally localizes it in university, which is not actually a very public forum. It makes it quite self-involved, and makes it everyone's fighting their own corner rather than fighting against the austerity measures as a unified force. So I think actually placing them within universities just makes it kind of elitist and fights a very narrow corner, when actually everyone is kind of fighting along similar lines. But what we need to do is really to get the issues of student fees and pensions and all of the issues, and the NHS and things like that, to all fight together in a coherent and public manner, rather than trying to kind of fight your own corner in your own space, which I think is just being ignored, to be honest.
Does anyone else have a question, or should I just allow the panel to come back?
Not a very well formulated question. Sorry, but yeah, I just think one of the things that I noticed, like, certainly kind of being a student activist last year and now leaving university, is this sort of very weird thing where there's on one hand universities are kind of marketing themselves as like ways to get a job, and then actually as soon as you leave university you find that that is a complete impossibility, and in order to do that you're expected to kind of give your labour for free anyway in the form of internships, because you haven't accumulated enough experience, because obviously you've been at university for the last 3 years, and actually even in itself it's not seen as a ticket to a job in any sense. And I think it's something that really is quite galling for a lot of people, because it's really ramping up fees and driving away thousands of people anyway, and people that are lucky enough to be able to afford them will still be in a point where they'll be shackled with debt and have to then find a way of providing their labour for free. And I don't know, I wonder what you guys think. Is there a possibility for people who, like recent graduates who are in that kind of precarious work and looking to have to do free internships, is there a kind of place to link that with the student movement? I guess, in a sense, like what you're saying, kind of bringing those struggles together a bit, because clearly that doesn't stop as soon as you leave the university grounds.
We'll just take one more question from Neil, and then I'll let the panel come back on those 3 points.
I just want to come back on this thing about that you raised at the front about the student struggle being seen to be a bit.
So do you want to start with Maisie?
It was characterised as legitimate initially by the management, but I think the occupation, as it kind of went on and unfolded, it turned that on its head completely. At least at SOAS it did, and I'm sure it did at other universities as well. It really became there was no way. It was absolutely meaningless for the management to say that it was an illegitimate form of protest, which is what they started out saying. And they stopped saying it, in fact, because even they realised that it really wasn't legitimate, because it kept going on and on and on, and kept getting support. And actually, at SOAS, obviously I can't speak for other universities, but the staff had finally got together and they signed a letter, and something like almost 300 staff signed a very strong letter against management in support of the occupation. So it was completely, we can't say that it was illegitimate in any way. And actually, I think the kinds of things that we were discussing in the occupation were actually much more sort of, is what people wanted to learn. It was like a whole, and in that sense also it was an impressive thing. So I think to answer your question, I think it has to be both. I think you kind of, it's good that all this is happening outside the universities, but it can happen also inside the universities and in workplaces for that matter, because it actually it does force everyone to make a decision. Do you support the occupation or not? Are you against the cuts or not? And so having a localized decision to make, as well as being able to be part of something broader on a national level, I think both are crucial.
Just very quickly, I think the failure of the occupations and the movement last year was that people didn't really understand what was going on. People still think that something like the Brown Review was voted on the 9th of December or something like this, when all that happened, there was a snap parliamentary vote around a statutory instrument that raised a maximum tuition fee. It was a deliberate strategy to take on a very quick thing up front, which was the most contentious and most easy to explain. Was an enormous concession one. The Lib Dems had to be given the concession that the repayment thresholds would be linked to wage inflation, and that changes the mechanics of the loan scheme quite dramatically. Unfortunately, not in a good sense, because although that looks like it benefits individuals, because the repayment threshold will follow wage inflation over the years, and so it doesn't fix at a certain point and more people start paying back. Unfortunately, the issue now is not the individual graduate debt. The issue is the national liability of not enough people repaying back the loans made. And we can't stress this enough. The problem now is it doesn't look like enough money is going to come back into the scheme, so the scheme becomes a liability for the nation. And that really is something people have to get their heads around in order to organise successfully, because any campaign which talks about higher fees is going to find itself on side with the government. The government's whole policy now is to drive down the fees set by greedy, inefficient universities. All of their policies are about reducing the exposure on the loan book by making universities go below 7,500 and lower. The reason why they're bringing in the American multinationals is not so those American multinationals can charge 9,000, it's because they can roll out degree programs for 4,000, for 5,000, and undercut the established universities. So it's very important to realise that if you complain about higher fees, you must understand the mechanisms at work. The issue is that most universities, particularly in London, because they've removed London weighting from the scheme, which used to be there in the terms of the grants the universities got. The issue is that most universities require about £8,000 in London to run a degree course. If you're driving that down, that means although students are paying more, what they're getting in return is underfunded, particularly when you think that with these problems of recruitment, more and more universities are going to have to spend money on marketing in order to get places in the first place. Recruitment really shouldn't be a problem for universities, given the nature of the demand we currently have. But by creating this artificial rigged market, in a zero-sum game, every AAB student becomes this valuable commodity that every university is going to want to recruit. Every student with AOB or better. University is going to plough recruitment money into those. It's a ludicrous, inefficient waste of money in the higher education resource. And in that sense, what's going to happen is not so much, the issue isn't how much you're going to pay for university, it's what you're going to get from going to it. The whole tenor of the white paper is to stratify degree quality, so that if you pay more, you get more, but you can also be offered a value for money product at 5,000, which is maybe a two-year rapid accelerated degree, which would train you for a job. And all the pressure is about presenting people with training for employability, and any broader sense of higher education has been lost. Now, in terms of a national campaign, I think that's fundamentally important, because what we're seeing is not how much to charge to go to university, it's what is the nature of higher education in the first place. And the whole, this Cambridge response is quite clear. We could be left with a depleted university sector and damaged communities. That's the official response from Cambridge Council, the governing body of Cambridge University, to the white paper. If for-profit providers come in, undercut, destroy the established provision, they have no wider social remit. All they're doing is taking in your money, and you might get a qualification at the end of it. They don't have any broader social responsibility. They're not interested in championing social equality or democracy, and that is a fundamental challenge to the country, and it's that should be the focus of any campaign.
Thank you. Sorry, I just really need to cough. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Just this issue about how to galvanise public opinion. I don't think we can look to the media. There's a long, long history in this country of the media routinely misrepresenting all kinds of political disputes. Even the BBC, a so-called public service broadcaster, the general strike, the miners' strike, time and time again the media undermines or tries to undermine popular democracy. That may change, and I think what Vasey said about this whole sort of recent controversy surrounding the Murdoch-gate scandal. For the first time in, let's see, 150 years, we may actually have a regulated press. For the first time, a press that's truly diverse, pluralistic. There are very strict rules about concentration of ownership. That may change, but at this moment in time, I wouldn't worry too much. Yes, it's important that we, redress sort of media bias and misrepresentations, but I don't think we should be worrying too much about what the media is saying. I think what really matters is that sort of bottom up, that groundswell, sort of building the popular movement, like we're doing today through word of mouth. Just quickly, internships, they're a disgrace, and I think I'm always shocked to see the kinds of, it's not just big business, it's not just hairdressers, and actually a lot of organisations, yes, and so-called progressive, socially democratic organisations have earned internships. We have a minimum wage and they should pay it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, really true. I think it's quite an interesting article today.
Can I just comment on that? It looks increasingly likely that education will be less regulated than the press, and even football, there will be no fit and proper owners test on universities. It's no accident that News Corporation are expanding into education. News Corp approached Tower Hamlets in August about running an academy school. They're going to get out of print media for this reason, but they'll go into education because all of the government tendencies is to deregulate it, to allow anybody to come in and let the market sort out what's on offer.
There were 3 more hands that went up. I think it was Chris, Paul and Sam. If you keep them brief, that would be wonderful.
I would like to ask questions about how to help moving forward. But I also think
of a vote in anything like the tuition fee cap vote last December. It's going to be very difficult to organise for that reason. I'll just give 2 examples. The government passed into law the decision to allow students of private providers to access up to £6,000 in tuition fee loans in 2012. They did that over the summer in the recess by using a secondary instrument Nobody looked at it. It became law on the 1st of September. On the 9th of November, when there's the next week, the House of Lords has its third reading of the education bill. Tucked away at the end of that is the clause that gives the government the power to set market rates on student loans. Okay, 2 examples. Everything's coming through piecemeal. You have to look to find it. It's very hard to find it. They don't publish the timetables in any sense that enables you to organise quickly. They only published that date last week. All these things are going to come through in dribs and drabs. And it's very important then to try and focus on the things that have to come through in a much clearer way where the plans can be seen. There will be primary legislation next year, probably in May, and that might be the stuff that allows universities to facilitate sellouts to for-profit, so that for-profit come in and buy off university resources, and that then is, I think, the thing to focus around.
I think the public, they are making those connections. Just to give a sort of anecdotal example, I had an open day just last week, parents, students, prospective students, and the number of parents actually got talking about politics, about the cuts, about tuition fees, about pensions. It was remarkable. Typically, 2 years ago, they would come and they would ask sort of rather banal questions about, class sizes. But actually, they're making these connections. Parents realise that as of next year, they're shelling out £9,000 per year. They're feeling the pinch, and they want to know what they're getting, but also, I think given the opportunity, they will, people will talk about those kinds of issues. So, hopefully, sort of the 30th will bring together, students, parents, employees, trade unions. Yes.
Yeah, 2 points. Just on the point about core, I think absolutely. Coalition Resistance. I think it's a brilliant campaign. It's very outward-looking. It recently had a European conference. It's very, obviously very conscious of what's happening in the rest of Europe. Its slogan is no cuts, which I think is very uncompromising, which I think is exactly what you need in this situation. And it was on all the student demos last year. So I think absolutely. In terms of just the general point about fighting back, I think we shouldn't sort of we should have the confidence to they want to move the argument on their territory. They want to sort of say, but the students don't really know what they want, or the Occupy movement isn't really clear what they want, or they're trying to say, okay, come up with solutions within our system. And actually a lot of people are saying we don't want your system at all. So it's not even a question about we're unclear here or we're unclear there. In the process of struggling, we will find new solutions to things, and I think that's what we need to have, the confidence to be able to stand up and say that and be very confident. We don't want to argue on your terms. We don't want your system at all.
Brilliant. I'd like to say thank you to Michael, Andrew and Faisie for a wonderful sort of introduction to this and to the book, and thank you all for a really great, open and challenging conversation and discussion on it. It's been really good. Thank you.